At this time, a lot of people are experiencing intense emotions, often on a daily basis. Whether or not that's you, this exploration of how to deal with intense emotions, I think, is profoundly beneficial for all of us for when those emotions come up. Of course, how to deal with it is not really the right phrase. In fact, people come to me, people come to, as far as I know from talking to them, all spiritual teachers get this question, which is, how do I deal with this? What do I do with this? And almost always the question, what do I do with this feeling or emotion I'm having, is a veiled way of saying, how do I get rid of it? How do I solve it? How do I fix it? How do I modify it? How do I transmute it? Which is a spiritually correct, veiled way of saying, how do I get rid of it, oftentimes. So the first thing I want to say is that's not the most beneficial attitude or mind frame to approach the situation with, okay? A lot of people have the idea that there's such thing as negative emotions and that the proper thing to do with negative emotions is just let it go. And certainly in the path of tantric yoga, that is not the teaching. And I like to say, replace the phrase let it go with let it flow. Because truly speaking, the only thing to do with intense emotions, or any emotions, is to allow them to flow through. And so emotional energy, just like any energy, gets stuck only when we're grasping onto it or pushing it away. Either of those actions, which are just inverse forms of each other, will often cause the energy to stick. So if there's anything to do, it's simply to become conscious of how you're pushing it away or grabbing onto it, depending on the emotion, and to relax that impulse, that compulsion, and let the energy flow. Let the emotional energy flow through you. That's what energy wants to do. It wants to move. It wants to flow. A poet, I can't remember who it was, but I love this line, who says, this is the purpose of emotion, to let a streaming beauty flow through you. And that is just so in line with the teachings of Tantric Yoga, because it's said in this tradition that if you can be with whatever the emotion is non-judgmentally, then it reveals itself to you as an aspect of beauty, specifically of the beauty of being alive. Whatever the emotion is, could be anger, could be fear, could be grief, it's beautiful when seen with the inner eye, the divine eye, the eye of truth. It's an aspect of the beauty of aliveness. And we're only afraid of those emotions because we're afraid of them getting stuck and being stuck in them. So it's really important to realize that one of the main ways that we attach to or push away any emotional energy is through a story, and we might not even realize we're doing it. So stories, believing a story or an interpretation, is a good way to get the energy stuck, which naturally wants to move. A very common example, for example, if somebody is grieving, whether it's somebody who's, if it's somebody, a loved one who's died, and there's grief happening, oftentimes the person who's alive will feel, sometimes even subconsciously, that to not grieve anymore would be an act of disloyalty in some way to the loved one who's died. And so believing that causes the energy to stay around longer, causes it to stick, as it were. When in nature, in our natural being, grief comes in waves, and eventually those waves get smaller, and eventually they subside. Sometimes it takes a little longer, sometimes it's a little shorter, depending on the person. But there's a natural process, and who are we to question the wisdom of nature, of our natural being? So laying aside the story as best you can, just, what does it feel like to just be without that story for a moment and just be with the feeling and let it come when it comes, but let it go when it goes, right? So that's just another way of saying allow it to move through. Don't grab on, don't push away. Another example might be, let's say you're in a relationship and that relationship ends for whatever reason. If you believe the story, consciously or subconsciously, I'll never be loved like that again, then the grief of the end of the relationship becomes unbearable. It lasts way longer than it naturally would if you didn't believe the story. Okay? But these are examples of so-called negative emotions. Of course, in reality, there's no such thing as a negative emotion. That's just a phrase you use to refer to emotions you don't like to feel. But energy, all energy enlivens the energy body when you let yourself be with it non-judgmentally. There's no such thing as negative energy, right? The energy doesn't harm you. It's just energy, right? When you can experience it that way, you see the truth of what I'm saying. It might seem harmful when you're believing in an associated story that causes the energy to get stuck and starts to fester or stagnate. So I just want to point out that this goes for positive emotions too. Sometimes, whether it's love or pleasure or bliss, we sort of want to grab onto it and hang onto it, and it gets stuck. And positive emotions can stagnate and fester too, and create some skaras, impressions of unresolved experiences in the system. And in the case of so-called positive emotions, actually, no such thing. Those are just the emotions you like. In the case of positive emotions, you can get into a cycle which leads to addiction, or grasping, craving, feeding the energy of that. So it really, whatever we're talking about, the answer is let it flow through. And if it's something that seems to be coming from outside of you that's really kind of a mental construct. But still, if it seems to be an energy that's coming into you from outside, then modify the statement a little bit to say, let it all the way in and through. Okay? Because when we try to push it away, then we're communicating to our energy body that we're not safe, that certain energies are not safe, we can't let them in. Yes, certain beliefs cause suffering, but energy is energy. All of it enlivens the energy body. So lay aside the story, let the energy all the way in and through. That is the watchword, the guideline in Tantric Yoga, and I myself can testify very wholeheartedly to the effectiveness of this approach. And if it's a paradigm shift, it might be a little scary or uncomfortable at first, but it really is so much more of a alive and joyous way to live. Lastly, I want to mention, because before I was talking about natural emotions that are amplified, artificially amplified by stories. But I also want to mention some emotions only exist because you're believing a particular story. Okay? Meaning they don't exist independently of the story. Some do and some don't. For example, if you look at the news media, and on the basis of the news media, form or attached to a story, the world is in trouble, everything's getting worse, then that is going to create an emotion, a feeling, a sensation, which might be profoundly uncomfortable or unpleasant, right? But that feeling is a direct result of believing the story. And let's just look for a moment at why believing the story is insane. It's because whatever you see in any news media source is just this tiny, 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 very, very, very partial fragment or sliver of what's going on in the world. What's going on in the world is everything. Everything all the time, especially in the era in which we live, where there's more people on Earth at once than there has ever been. The whole range of human activities is happening everywhere. It's impossible, literally impossible, for the mind to make any valid generalization whatsoever about the world, okay? Because whatever you want to make, there's going to be countless counterexamples. If you want to say everything's getting better, countless counterexamples. If you want to say everything's getting worse, countless counterexamples, right? It's just a mental construct. It has no validity, okay? And of course, I hope you know and keep firmly in mind that news media is saturated with primarily negative stories or unsettling or troubling stories because that's part of what keeps people consuming. That is the economy that we have. When people are scared or uncomfortable, they're more likely to buy things that make them feel better. So that's a little footnote, big part of what's going on. So you get the idea, I hope. It's very important to do self-reflection, self-inquiry, contemplation, where you discover, is this a naturally occurring emotion, just part of the human experience, that I'm amplifying by believing a story? Or is this an emotion that only exists because I'm believing a particular story, you know? So there's other possibilities, but those are usually the main ones. Of course, sometimes spontaneous arising organic emotions can move through the system with no story, you know, in which case it's just a matter of opening up and allowing them to flow through and feeling that aliveness, feeling the beauty of that aliveness, you know. This is the purpose of emotion, to let a streaming beauty flow through you. So this is one of the most important topics, actually, in Tantric Yoga, because when you strengthen the energy body, then you have a very different experience of life. It's no longer oppressive. It's no longer overwhelming. It's no longer filled with anxiety. It is, for the most part, filled with aliveness and quite a lot of joy and a feeling of connection and even an ability to perceive the inherent rightness of the big picture, of the pattern of human life overall, even though any given little specific example might be unpleasant, horrifying even, might not feel right. It's part of a bigger pattern. With a strong energy body, you can look and see for yourself the truth that the pattern is right. Not right in the sense of right versus wrong, but sort of exactly as it should be, perfect unto itself, and unfolding in a perfect way. If you don't see that yet, genuinely see that, as opposed to just believe it. Strengthen the energy body. How do you do that? The number one way is through digesting your emotions, digesting your experiences, right? Allowing them to be fully present in your being, allowing them to move through, laying aside the story. Naturally, some of that energy digests and some of it releases, right? So that every time you do that successfully, it strengthens the energy body. Whether you're digesting a samskara, an impression of unresolved past experience, or a present moment experience, in the same way, it strengthens the energy body. Om.